Right, a very good morning to you and welcome to everyone who is joining us on this very exciting webinar. And thank you for joining us. We will be, of course, having more join us. We're expecting quite a group. There's much anticipation for this webinar. So a very warm welcome to you and welcome to our webinar on From Compliance to Sustainability, the role of NRCS and NRS. My name is Gareth Burley. I'm part of the manufacturing work group. I've been with a company called Microcare since the early 2010s, 2011s. We're a company that manufactures renewable energy projects, inverters, and we're celebrating our 35th year of manufacturing this year. So we very much invested into the Sapphire working group. Sapphire, of course, committed to driving the growth and sustainability of local solar PV. And this manufacturing working group, we've been running that for a few years now, focusing on strengthening local manufacturing. It's great to have our team and committee with us joining on the webinar as well. So warm welcome to them. Of course, high standard products, advocating supportive policies are all part of what this working group and the work of Sapphire is all about. And yeah, this webinar really is in something that we've been talking about for a while, and we're delighted to be able to bring it to you here this morning on the Sapphire platform. And I think part of the ongoing efforts in navigating sort of regulatory requirements while also sort of advancing the sustainability goals that we have at Sapphire. So yeah, delighted to have you all with us. Today's discussion, from compliance to sustainability, NRCS, NRS. So much talk at the moment about Eskom and end users and what's going to be happening in terms of the industry. SSEG is such a hot topic as it has been in various municipalities. Everyone does different approaches. So what is NRS? What is NRCS? Well, I'm delighted to introduce two speakers who I met at the Africa Energy Indaba recently, and that is Ruan Coetzee and Leon Roos. I'm delighted to have them both with us today to be able to speak a little bit about this hot topic. And it's such an important one for us right now in terms of not only local manufacturers, but in terms of the solar industry in South Africa. So just to introduce them, Ruan Coetzee, Compliance Officer at Bravo Scan. He's an approved electrical inspection authority, specializing in electrical installations, extensive experience in the provisions of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. He's got a strong background in litigation. He's a trusted expert on legal aspects of compliance and safety standards. He's got a BCom, LLB, and project management diploma, construction contract certificate, and has got advanced knowledge in consumer protection and banking law. In his current role, he also ensures adherence to regulatory frameworks and provides guidance on navigating complex legal requirements in the electrical industry. And Ruan's actually joining us from court this morning, so we really appreciate Ruan's time. And then Leon Roos, his colleague, is a highly skilled electrical inspector and qualified master installation electrician. He's based here in South Africa. He's got extensive experience in electrical engineering, safety, and compliance. Currently, he serves as the chairman of the Working Group 07 at the South African Bureau of Standards. He leads the incorporation of the IEC 60364 into the South African National Standards. And in addition to this working group, he also participates in several other working groups and committees, including those focused on renewable energy, solar PV systems, and emerging electrical technologies. So really delighted to have Leon and Ruan join us this morning. Really appreciate their time. Just as we go into our presentation, this webinar this morning, just to remind you that we're a working group, so we are learning, we're trying to engage with the industry, particularly local manufacturers, so we'd appreciate your input. But this is such an amazing opportunity to deepen our understanding of compliance, quality standards, and the role in sustainable energy adoption in South Africa. So we encourage you to participate. There's a chat box that's open as well. Feel free to ask questions as we go. Ruan and Leon are pressed for time, so we're going to try and stick to our schedule and then try our best to answer the questions. We've had many requests. Can we get copies of this? Some people can't make it. Yes, of course, it will be available. So once again, welcome to our first webinar from our working group, the manufacturing working group. And I'm going to hand over to Leon and Ruan, who are going to jump straight into it for us, rather, as we talk about this hot topic. So Leon and Ruan, thank you so much for your time, and over to you. We can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. I just want to make sure that you can hear me?
Yes, 100%. Thank you.
Gareth, thank you to Sapphire and the team. We at BravoScan are first of all, always honored to help Sapvia. We feel that Sapvia is a very important organization, and we share a lot of values. Ultimately, at the end of the day, being that electrical installations should be sustainable and safe. And yeah, we love being part of your groups and ultimately just presenting and just and this is a very important topic, the NRCS and the NRS. And to be quite honest with you, when I started doing with the research, I told the vet and the rest of your team that we have to ultimately limit the scope that we are presenting and the definitions, and just focus on the NRS and the NRCS, because if we go going into SANAs and SABs, that's a whole different scenario. So for today's topic, let's just focus firstly on the NRS and the NRCS. And with that, I just want to make sure that everybody can see my screen. And if there's anything, Gareth, if you can just confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes, 100%. Thank you.
All right. I just want to get my trusty highlighter here to show everyone where we are. All right. So obviously the topic is what is the law, the NRCS or the NRS? And the way that we are going to demonstrate what the difference is between the NRCS and the NRS is by understanding and looking at the legal framework and making a legal comparison as to what is the difference and ultimately your obligations. But before we can get to the NRS, for today, let's just make sure that what we understand, and this is a slide that was drafted by the NRS. The NRS is focused mainly, and just so that everybody knows, when we're dealing a little bit of where the user's rights start and when the supplier's rights end and obligations end. This is when we're dealing with the NRS, it's usually your suppliers on the supply side to the house, and it's everything in red, basically. And then your user is faced with similar obligations and issues on the user side, and that's everything in green. But somewhere in the middle, these two have to meet, and then they have to work together. And the user is faced with the SANS 10142 Part 1 code, and obviously the NRS 09721 that's the utility interface, and your supplier actually operates on the NRS. But we're going to provide clarity a little bit later as to the NRS and all of these things, and I hope it's going to be clear. But just from a starting point, this is basically where today's topic is going to focus on. What is the user's obligations, and what's the NRS obligation, and how does the NRCS fit into all of this ultimately, right? This just also, when you look at the slides, this is literally the regulatory framework also drafted by the NRS. And as you can see, the Occupational Health and Safety Act is both on the utility side as well as on the user side. But in this particular instance, the user is obligated to comply with the SANS 10142 Part 1. And this on the utility side, the utility is also faced with complying with the SANS 10142 Part 1, but they also deal with the NRS and in order to get to the distribution and the license and Eskom's requirements, ultimately to basically the whole supply chain up to I want to say the power plants. All right. On your user side, you also have the utility electricity bylaw, meaning your supplier's bylaw. It might be in some instances that your supplier is the municipality. In other instances, it might be Eskom itself. Like if you go to Soweto, and there is nuance and different changes as to how your electricity bylaws are implemented, but we'll get into the nitty-gritty a little bit later in terms of it. But I just wanted to set the framework and the foundation to kick off this presentation, as to show that there's a lot of regulations and there's a lot of acts applicable both on the utility side as well as then on the property owner or the user side. But before we start, we work from the premise that standards are good and compulsory to comply with in South Africa. I hope that everybody understands the importance of standards and why they are there. But the way that we apply them might differ from certain aspects. And there's a lot of arguments and legal opinions out there, how we should go about it, which one should precede which one. If there is a conflict, how do we deal with that conflict? And hopefully by the end of this presentation, everybody will be have the same clarity or have the same basis where we can start off from. But in the South African law, we start off with the Standards Act. That is I would say the basis of all standards. It incorporates the SABS and the SANAS, two of the most important bodies that incorporate standards. But for today's topics, they are just going to be stepped aside. You also find the obligation to comply with standards in terms of the Consumer Protection Act. We're going to deal very extensively with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And then your municipal bylaws, we're going to just deal a little bit and to see where the standards fit in terms of that. And then obviously your Electricity Regulation Act. Now, this is where your municipalities and your suppliers, they they'll more work under the Electricity Regulation Act than the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And I found that people confuse the electricity regulations, which is incorporated into the Occupational Health and Safety Act. They confuse it with the actual act, the Electricity Regulation Act. So it's very paramount when we're proceeding that there's a distinction between the electrical installation regulations, and then there is something that we call the Electricity Regulation Act. And you don't necessarily need to know the whole act. You just need to understand Section 26 of the Electricity Regulation Act when you're dealing with your supplier or your municipality. All right. Just some brief background of the Standards Act. The Standard Act makes provision that standards can become mandatory, but in SAP's repertoire of standards of nearly 5,000, only 53 of those standards are mandatory. And one of the most predominant one that we deal with is obviously the electricity standard that each and everyone knows. It's the SANS 10142 Part 1. And just some I would say some interesting information from your guys, that this information has been extracted from the International Trade and Administration from the US Department of Commerce. So they are all the countries on an international basis are collaborating with one another, understanding where standards are implemented, where products can go, because it impacts trade ultimately. And that is why standards are very important. And the US Department of Commerce are focusing on South Africa as what standards we implement and where we implement it and how we implement it, because we're one of the biggest economies in Africa. And having a negative standard or having a standard on a particular product or a particular requirement heavily impacts our trade in terms of our GUA, and yeah, so that is why it's important that they focus, or they know what standards we are implementing in order to facilitate trade. But when we focus more on the South African side, and this is when the manufacturers as well as the installers are faced, we deal with the Consumer Protection Act in terms of Section 55, that promotes a consumer's right to safe and good quality of goods. All right. And in terms of Section 55, subsection 2, subsection D, any product needs to comply with the Standards Act or any other public regulation. And that is where it opens the door for the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And so as a manufacturer or as an installer, you'll face the Department of Labor, which operates under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. You can face the Consumer Protection Ombudsman that operates under the Consumer Protection Act. And all of these acts are actually intertwined. And although their approaches might differ on nuances and timeframes and everything, but ultimately at the end of the day, what everyone is striving for is good, safe, quality goods, and to prevent death or harm that arises. But we're going to focus more on the Occupational Health and Safety Act because there's a lot of litigation as well as interesting developments in the law in that regard. But it is also underlined in terms of the Consumer Protection Act. So I just wanted to make that point and to bring that in so that people can't say I wasn't thorough and that standards are implemented in other legislations as well. Okay. When we look at the standard, the actual challenge that we face when we deal with the Occupational Health and Safety Act is the definition of a standard, right? A standard is defined as a compulsory specification in terms of the Standards Act. So that is where the SABS goes out and incorporates a specific standard, or under the new development, the NRCS. So a standard is either something that is stipulated by SABS or by the NRCS. But the Occupational Health and Safety Act, although the Act was written in 1993, opened the door for regulators and as well as the communities and the, I want to say, the economic stakeholders to develop and promote good industry practices. And they opened the door in terms of the definition of a standard to mean any specification, code, or any other directive having standardization as an aim, issued by an institution or organization inside or outside the Republic, which whether generally or with respect to any particular article or matter, or whether internationally or in any particular country or territory, seeks to promote standardization. Now, the reason why I read that and want to focus on that aspect of the definition of a standard in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act is because it opens the door for the NRS, as well as SANS, as well as the IEC standards and the codes and industry codes that they develop to be also regarded as a standard in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. All right. I hope everybody is with me. So when we focus then particularly on the Occupational Health and Safety Act, we've got this definition that is very wide of what a standard is or a health and safety obligation would be. But Section 22 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act makes it compulsory that you must comply with a health and safety standard that has been prescribed. But the definition of prescribed is opened in the sense that although the NRS may make a standard, the moment that it isn't incorporated into some sort of legislation, it doesn't find application under Section 22. And you'll see where the problem arises a little bit later on when we come to the definition of reasonable practicable in the definition. So Section 22 just provides you with this general obligation that you have to comply with any health and safety standard that has been prescribed. So where it has been prescribed, it has to be incorporated into some sort of legislation. All right. Section 10 goes a little bit further and says that any person who designs, manufactures, imports, sells, or supply, and this is where it also becomes applicable on, I would say, on this forum and all the manufacturers that are on the table, that you are also obligated to ensure that the article is reasonably, where as far as reasonably practicable, that the article is safe and without risk when properly used, and that it complies with all prescribed requirements. Right? And then for our installers, Section 10.2, any person who erects or installs any article for use at work on or in any premises shall ensure as far as reasonably practicable that nothing about the manner in which it's erected and installed makes it unsafe or creates a risk to health and safety when properly used. And I just want to draw the distinction in terms of Section 22 and Section 10. Section 22 makes it a provision that in the moment that you sell an article or there's a transfer of ownership, or when you market it, you have to comply with this health and safety standard, prescribed health and safety standards. Section 10 says when you design a product, you might not necessarily have sold it, or you might not have be the party responsible for the selling thereof, but you might be the party responsible for the design or the manufacturing. You also have that obligation. All right. And Section 10.2 says you might not have sold the product, you might not have designed this product, but you have installed the product. So to be quite honest with you, Section 22, read with Section 10, it covers each and every component, the whole supply chain of electrical goods being imported and installed in South Africa. So there's no wiggle room for negotiation. The only difference is Section 10 says, as far as reasonably practicable, in addition to, that is where the and is important, with the prescribed requirements. So you'll start off with the prescribed requirements and you'll add the elements of reasonable practicable. And I know it might seem a little bit confusing now, but when we're going to go a little bit, and how do we, I want to say the process, how do we apply all of this information that I'm going to give you? It's going to become clear in the court cases how it has been applied, right? Just so that you know, in terms of Section 10, as far as reasonably practicable, it's a determinable definition. There's certain steps that you need to take into consideration, as well as all prescribed requirements. And prescribed by this means it is incorporated into some form of legislation. All right, and the same goes for the installer. Reasonable, practicable, and it is and it is incorporated into all prescribed requirements. All right. I just have to brush up as well on Section 9, because when we're going to deal with the court case a little bit later to demonstrate how the correct approach and how dealing with this, just for every person's attention, is that every employer shall conduct his undertaking in such a manner as to ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, that persons other than those in his or her employment who may be directly affected by his activities are thereby not exposed to a hazard to their health and safety. And I find it very, I find it this question coming up with my colleagues that I discussed, that obviously the definition is here for you are creating an industry, but Section 9 expands your accountability to any person that may be affected by your enterprise. And so there is this general accountability to the members of the public as well. And it's a very wide responsibility, and it sometimes is perplexed because in South Africa we don't have something that we call strict liability. And in order to define that a little bit or provide clarity, strict liability is more found in other jurisdictions like the USA or Germany per se, and it can be simply summarized as the rule is you're not supposed to drive over the white line. And the moment that you drive over the white line, you are liable. And so you're in a car, you drive over the white line and you drive into oncoming traffic, you are automatically liable, regardless of the reason why you've driven over the white line. The fact that you've driven over the white line, that is why you're liable. And that is strict liability. In South Africa, the Constitutional Court said, we don't actually impose strict liability because there might be a valid reason why you transgress the rule. And that is when you go look at the definitions of negligence we're going to deal with a little bit later. There is an inquiry as to the court, what had transpired and should or did somebody would somebody in similar circumstances act in accordance with your conduct? Because let's say you're driving on the road and somebody runs into the road, or there's a dog and you swerved out, or it was and therefore it in a sense becomes an accident because it's unavoidable, and therefore you cannot necessarily be held liable just because you broke the rule. And that is the premise in our common law, which means we don't enforce strict liability. There is an inquiry as to what we call the negligence inquiry, that transpires to determine if there's actual fault on your end. But with Section 9, you'll see a little bit later, this section imposes strict liability. And it's very important to remember now, you have to read Section 9 with that strenuous obligations in terms of Section 22 of all prescribed health and safety requirements, and that very wide definition of standards, as well as then your obligation in terms of Section 10. So faced with this from a legal perspective, it means that Doesn't matter if there's a requirement and it has been incorporated into some sort of law, you technically have to comply thereto. And that is underpinned by the Consumer Protection Act and Section 9, Section 10 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And this is where we are now. But when we move on a little bit, the Occupational Health and Safety Act provides a little bit of alleviance. We're dealing with this immense standards. They are incorporating international standards, whatever the case may be. You as the manufacturer or the installer, you need now to decide what do I need to do, or what is my steps in order to bring a product to market or to correctly install it. And the Occupational Health and Safety Act defines reasonably practicable as to mean you have to take into consideration the severity and scope of the hazard or the risk concerned. Unfortunately, with the electrical industry, the severity and the scope of the hazard that or the risk we are dealing with is electrocution. And you need a very little bit of power or very little bit of voltage in order to electrocute someone very severely or cause death. So the severity and the scope of a hazard in the electrical industry is very, I would say, is very severe. It's very harsh. If you apply this test into another industry, let's say plumbing, you might not deal necessarily with the same severity scope of the hazard, because technically if you're a plumber and something goes wrong, you just let it go in the street, you know. But there might be other health and safety concerns, but you're not necessarily dealing with death or the electrocution outright, okay? And this is now where reasonable practicable, in a sense, also complicates the matter, because it says you have to take into consider the state of knowledge reasonably available concerning that risk or hazard, and any means of removing or mitigating that hazard or risk. And this is why SAPVIA, the NRS, SANS, SABS, all of these bodies are important, because they are putting out the state of knowledge of an industry, or they are providing routes of best practices. So this also doesn't provide technically the alleviation that we wanted for the electrician, especially when we're now considering the NRS or the NRCS, which way we must go. The term of reasonably practicable says, you know what, we have to take all of this into consideration, all right? Then reasonably practicable says you have to then also take into consideration the availability and suitability of the means to remove or mitigate that risk. And for the technical people, that is where your technical expertise is, you rely heavily on, because you have to factor into how difficult will it be in order to prevent us from electrocuting someone. Is it in putting a relay? Is it an earth permanent neutral bond? Is it an additional switch here? What do we need to do in order to, and the suitability to remove and mitigate that risk? And this is where most of the conflict between, I want to say, the technical people arise, because each one is trying to advocate the best availability and suitability for his or her solution. But we're not done, because reasonably practicable also says you have to take into consideration the cost of removing or mitigating the hazard or risk. And this is where most electricians stop reading, saying that, you know, it's too expensive, I'm not going to apply this particular solution, or I'm not going to incorporate that component. But the term expands to say you have to take the cost of removing or mitigating that risk or hazard in relation to the benefits derived therefrom. So 100 Rand switch compared to preventing somebody from electrocuting, or incurring a design change, although it might be a little bit more expensive, like 50 or 60,000 Rand, what is the benefits derived from therefrom? And this is the whole test that you need to apply in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act when it comes to dealing with strict liability. When you're giving execution and weighing up what specification are you going to follow, which one is the best, which one do I need to comply with? Because, and just to summarize, when you read the Consumer Protection Act and you read the Occupational Health and Safety Act, taking into consideration the definition, Section 10, Section 9, Section 22, it says you have to comply with everything. You have to comply with all of it. All right. And you need to now evaluate that compliance. If it's incorporated into legislation, it is an obligation to comply with it. And then reasonable practicable says you, in the event that it's not incorporated into a particular legislation, you must make a value judgment. When are you going to comply, and how you are going to comply, and is it cost benefit? Is the cost benefit that you're going to derive therefrom in order to comply? So this is a serious challenge that we face, and this is what we are trying to alleviate. And this is where all the confusion in the industry comes from, because this is what our legislation leaves us with. It's this mass array of everything that you need to comply with. But now this leads to confusion to the rest of the industry, because electricians would love to have a check sheet or something that's color coded to say step 1, step 2, step 3. And it's very difficult to provide them with that. All right. So electricians are faced with this insurmountable obligation to ensure compliance with health and safety standards. And yeah, obviously the industry now has created various bodies that provides additional, I would say, confusion into it. Just for clarity's sake, I forget to mention that the Occupational Health and Safety Act also bounds the state in terms of Section 47. So when the municipality comes and says, you know what, they're not obligated to comply with SANS 10142 Part 1, that is a user's obligation. That is technically incorrect, because the Occupational Health and Safety Act binds the state, and it includes local government, municipalities, and suppliers, right? And because I have this question a lot about manufacturers saying, you know, we provided the product, but we contracted somebody else to install the product. Ultimately, you can't get out of your obligations in terms of Section 44 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Regardless, the best contracts that you impose, when the regulator knocks at your door, they are going to impose Section 9, Section 10, and Section 22 on you, and they're not even going to take into consideration the agreements that you implemented. Right. But it might look dire. There is this wide variety of obligations that you need to be that you are faced with. The electrical installation regulations actually provide you with a little bit of a hierarchy of where the electrician should start. And obviously the electrical installation regulations was focused for the electrical installer. And it starts with 5.1, which says, no person may authorize, design, or install, or permit, or require the installation of an electrical installation other than in accordance with the health and safety standard incorporated into these regulations under Section 44 of the Act. And at this particular instance, only the SANS 10142 Part 1 standard has been incorporated. So your installers they need to start off with the SANS 10142 Part 1. We had this discussion with one big manufacturer bringing in an inverter, saying that a DC combiner box was not necessary because everything that the DC combiner box was doing was handled by the inverter itself. But if you go read the standard, the standard requires that the inverter must be able to be isolated by itself, and that requires a DC combiner box. So although a manufacturer might have a specification, the SANS 10142 Part 1 imposes a safe way of installation that is in addition to what a manufacturer standard would say. All right. So for the electrician, there's a little bit of clarity as to where to start by means of the SANS 10142 Part 1. All right. But your manufacturers are a little bit, they basically are also covered, and they can find alleviation in terms of Section 5.2, that no person may use components within within an electrical installation, unless those components comply with the standards referred to in the relevant incorporated standard referred to in sub-regulation 1, meaning the SANS 10142 Part 1, and proof of compliance shall be identifiable and on the components, or the certification shall be available from the manufacturer or supplier of materials and components in terms of the national regulator for compulsory specifications. All right. So it's not necessarily your SABS products, but you need to get confirmation from the national regulator for compulsory specifications. So, and in some instances, it's also the SABS. So, but I just want to avoid that pitfall. We are going to focus on the NRCS specifically today. Right, so first it's the SANS. Secondly, it's your components are covered by the NRCS. And then now Section 5 of Regulation 5.3, this is now where it provides us with another headache. Items of an electrical installation not covered by an incorporated health and safety standard and the conductors between the point of supply and the point of control shall be installed in accordance with the bylaws or regulations of the supplier concerned. All right. And it's this is where we need to focus on the municipal bylaws. All right. So this is a hierarchy that is been imposed by the electrical installation regulations. It's there for the installers as well as manufacturers and product developers as to how to approach this legislative minefield. All right. Firstly, before we continue, what is the NRCS? Because the NRCS, in a sense, overlaps SABS. But you have to understand the NRCS is developed or managed by the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, and it's an independent organization, all right, with its own regulatory division, all right, and it runs in conjunction with the South African Bureau of Standards, all right. But the NRCS is the compulsory leg that tests, that's accountable for the testing and compliance verification of imported products and regulating the market. Standards, South African Bureau of Standards, their main focus is on the development of standards. It can either be a voluntary or a compulsory standard if it's incorporated into legislation, but they also test products, but the consent, or I would say the permission that you need to get, is from the NRCS. And we can see that clearly from section of electrical installation regulation 5.2. All right. The NRCS promotes public health and safety and environmental protection. They are concerned of what is the quality of the products that you bring in. Is the product safe? Is the products adaptable or usable in the South African environment? And what's the risk associated with that? All right. There is some shortcomings with the NRCS, but that is an argument for another day. And just for clarity, the legislative mandate comes from more than just one act, like SABS. The Standards Act provides a mandate to SABS, but the NRCS not only gets their mandate from the Standards Act, they also get it from the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications Act and the National Building Regulations and Building Standards Act, as well as the Legal Metrology Act. So the NRS has got a bigger scope, and it's got a wide variety of functions that they fill. But ultimately, in short, the NRC is a statutory regulatory and compliance body, and compulsory obligations are set out in acts and regulations. So you have to comply with the NRCS specification, and that is the short and sweet. So I'm going to park the NRCS. You have to comply with the NRCS if there is a standard or a specification that they impose. All right. The black sheep of the family is the NRS. The NRS is the National Rationalized Specifications Association of South Africa, and it's a voluntary organization, which provides us with another headache, and you'll see why a little bit later. But it develops industry specifications, especially for the electricity and supply of distribution industries. But the NRS Association aims to improve the reliability and resilience of the national electricity grid. And from the documentation of the NRS, it is to say it's a user specification on behalf of the technical, but it's not a standard contemplated in the Standards Act. And they're very specific to say, you know what, this is not the Standards Act. And to put it in layman's terms, when the NRS was formed, you had Eskom, you had a wide variety of municipalities, but you only had one national grid of electricity supply. So these different municipalities, who had local government issues, supplier issues, or even in some instances, bigger or smaller demands, had to come together and to say, you know what, how do we cooperate with one another to ensure that the supply from the power plant up to where the power is used, that it's sustainable and reliable, and that we don't injure either Eskom personnel or municipalities personnel or members from the public. And the intent actually on the NRS was to create standard policies and procedures between the various suppliers, right? But this did not stay there. Obviously, they deal with a very wide technical field, and they deal with a very wide scope, and they provide advice. But if you go look back at the standard or the definition of standard in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, it can be that the NRS standards are also can be applicable on you as the manufacturer or supplier, although it might not be incorporated into legislation. It forms part of the state of knowledge of your industry or your state of knowledge of your industry or environment, right? I highlighted out why the voluntary aspect of the NRS provides a headache. And this is why we need to define who is the NRS. The NRS, in terms of their documentation, is usually the suppliers, right? They do have consultations with other industry or outside parties. So please don't lambast the NRS. They try to do the consultations and everything. My personal problem necessarily with the NRS is that standard is incorporated, but I would advocate for more greater consultation or collaboration. But who the NRS is usually it's this group of electricity suppliers, and then they might, or in some instances, consult with the greater industry, but they are focused primarily on the requirements of suppliers and municipalities, right? And now the requirement is it compulsory to comply with the NRS specification? Besides the definition of you need to take into consideration what the NRS says, is it compulsory? Is there a legal obligation to comply with the NRS standard? And like any good attorney, the answer is it depends. And I hope that everybody got that joke a little bit, all right? From the first instance, from the NRS, compliance is not always compulsory, because the intended application of the NRS specification is limited, and you can find this in the document itself, all right? It says the aim is not in order to be incorporated as a standard, all right? We want to deal with the problem for exclusive group of people. So from the NRS, as a voluntary organization, it's not compulsory to comply with from the outset. And it's very important to say from the outset. Okay. But NRS specifications can be adopted by NERSA, all right, in terms of the Electricity Regulation Act. NERSA has got the right to create advisory forums, and they may regulate and or advise the regulator as to any particular matter, all right? And that is where the NRS is powerful, in the sense that they collaborate with NERSA on various I want to say technical matters. They can also create customer or end user forums. So where I'm going to say the standards or the SANS 10142 Part 1 is a little bit shortfall, or where the supplier is exposed because of a particular standard, NERSA comes in and says, you know what, we're adopting the NRS standard in order to ensure that there is a coherency. And you can find that especially with load shedding and demand load between the suppliers and the end users. That is where the NRS specification was also quite powerful, right? But like I said, it's a voluntary organization, the NRS. That is why NERSA, when they have got a rulemaking process, before they can adopt the NRS, there is a procedure that they need to follow. And this is where I want to say the issue arises in the sense that there isn't necessarily enough collaboration, or the process that it was procedurally fair. Affected persons might not have been always provided with the opportunity to comment thereon. And I'm just going to point out for discussion sakes a little bit later on, this is where the City of Cape Town's supplier list might come in, because the supplier mandates this list. Other municipalities just copy this list, and there isn't a lot of collaboration as to the rationality behind it. But that list is not necessarily incorporated into the NERSA standard, because obviously there is a compliance procedure and that needs to happen. All right. If you remember Regulation 5.3, Electrical Installation Regulation 5.3, the supplier's bylaws can, in certain instances, specify certain standards that need to be adopted. And here, the Western Cape has adopted the NRS codes, and you'll see they also adopted the SANS codes, but they made specific provision of the NRS codes, and this is more focused on the electricity supply. All right, but we also have to make provision that they make specific mention that the safety standard means the Code of Practice for Wiring of Premises, the SANS 10142 Part 1, and the regulations mean the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So in this particular instance, the SANS 10142 is applicable, as well as the NRS codes, and this is not obviously for when it's adopted by municipalities. But we have to be very careful to approach this adoption of the NRS codes as uniformed, because the City of Tshwane doesn't adopt all of the NRS codes, as you can see here. All right. They also make provision for the SANS 104.2 Part 1 and the regulations of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And it's now, this is where you need to, I want to say, almost need to get a degree in legal theory, because Tshwane has imposed a catch-22 clause that says any specification can include any applicable national rationalized specification of the NRS. All right, so it's a very wide concept, a very wide aspect, and a definition that they can impose and say, but yeah, although we did not formally adopt it in terms of the bylaws, the NRS, we opened the door that there might be other specifications applicable. I didn't see it in other bylaws, but the City of Tshwane has got a very specific exclusion of liability to say that when they are inspecting and testing your installation at your house, for whatever the reason might be, they've got a discretion, but in to say that your electrical installation is compliant or not compliant, but it shall in no way relieve the consumer or the appointed electrical contractor, as the case may be, from his or her liability for any defect in the electrical installation regulations. So they resort back to the electricity installation regulations, and that is that imposes on the user that obligation, that strict liability, accountability in the sense. So, and that is why I say when you're dealing with the NRS, you have to, when we answer the question, is it should we comply with the NRS specifications, we have to very carefully say, how was the specification formed? Because obviously it deals with the voluntary aspect thereof. Is it for a particular group? Where was it adopted in terms of regulations, in terms of bylaws? Was it adopted, and what does that bylaw say as to your accountability as a user? All right. So, and then to add another issue in terms of it, the reason why the NRS cannot be, I would say, widely adopted is because of the limitations that are imposed on regulators as well as municipalities in regard to the promotion of administration of Justice Act. I apologize. Because the promotion of Administrative Justice Act specifically sets out what a fair procedure would be. And there it requires a lot of consultation, the purpose, you have to have the reasonable opportunity to partake. And that's why the process of SANS and SABS is open, the working groups, even SAPVIA's working groups. This is why it's very important, because it's the messy part of democracy where we need to discuss and elaborate and get together as to what are we doing, how is it going to be implemented, and where is it going to be incorporated. And so from the commencement, I would say, well, from the starting point, when we consider if an NRS standard is applicable, we have to say it cannot be outright be applicable. What was the rationality and the process and order before we adopted this NRS standard? All right. But I've provided you now with a lot of information. It might appear very confusing. It might there's a lot of different sections, different acts, different definitions that you're taking into consideration. And when I was doing my research, I really contemplated the question that is in front of you, that is a standard for success, or is a standard for disaster? And luckily I found the correct approaches in the court, how about to go deal with it. All right. But let's deal firstly how we should not adopt standards or utilize standards. All right. And this is where the disaster is for the suppliers. I'm gonna start off with the suppliers. In this particular case, there was an electrocution of a 11-year-old child because he climbed a pylon. All right. For transparency, and just to create the basis under which we need to understand this case. This case comes from the Electricity Regulation Act, the old Electricity Act, which has been renamed. Section 26, it imposes a civil liability on of negligence on the supplier if somebody is electrocuted from any municipal supply or transmitted infrastructure. All right. And the court goes out to stipulate that Eskom, in this particular instance, bore the onus, that it was not negligent. And that is where we come back to the questions, and you'll see on the next slide what the court basically determined is Section 26 of the Electricity Regulation Act says Eskom is negligent if somebody is electrocuted automatically. All right. But because Section 26 doesn't enforce strict liability, we don't do strict liability. That's the negligent part. We have to conduct now the negligence test. In terms of, I do about the negligence test is we have to say if there's a causal link between the negligence and the injuries sustained. I do apologize. So the causal link between the conduct, what was the obligation of the supplier, and obviously the injury sustained, and would a reasonable supplier in the similar instances have acted accordingly? And that is where that whole inquiry is in order to ensure that we don't enforce, that is where the distinction comes from, that we don't enforce strict liability. There's that whole inquiry as to determine negligence. All right. It's just because we're going to share the slides and people might find it very interesting to go read. The court had a full analysis of a pylon and where the pylon was and how it was constructed in terms of clause 3. So I'm not going to deal with it, but I want to get to clause to the clause 4 of the Act, which said that Eskom compiled these pylons in a standard design. All right, and there was a code of good practice, the NRS code, sorry, and according to Eskom's version, all of this complied to the NRS code, and this was a uniform code that was applied across the industry, right? But the court said that is not where the test for negligence ends, all right? The test is further. There's a second leg to the inquiry, namely whether a reasonable person would have taken steps to guard against the danger, all right? And the court refused and said, we as the court or in terms of law, it would be inappropriate to place any limitations on the negligence test. And the negligence test is highlighted here in the blue, the degree or the extent of the risk created by the actor's conduct, the gravity of the possible consequences of the harm materialized, the utility of the actor's conduct, and the burden of eliminating that risk of harm. And you'll see it is very, if it's not an exact copy, it's very close to what the obligation is in terms of reasonable practicable, right? And there was a whole debate about when you are complying with the NRS code as a supplier, which is the standard and the health and safety standard. They even considered the electrical machine regulations. And the court had a proper discussion and insight into these standards. And the court found that the standard, the NRS code, just said, and as well as the electrical machine regulations, said that a pylon must only be adequately protected. All right. However, neither of the NRS codes or the machine regulations provided what I would say what indication what adequate was. All right. But the court said we could rely on the NRS code, or the industry does, for further assistance. So the court looks at everything, at all of this, and they said, okay, you know what, we're looking at your obligation in terms of the Act, in terms of Section 22. We look on how you implement the NRS codes. We look on the standards. We look at the actual issue that arose. And would a other supplier, although there isn't another one, but would a other supplier act differently in terms of it, right? The court also said we should take into consideration, it was emphasized in evidence that regardless of the obligation, it would be virtually impossible to erect a barrier that was impenetrable. So the court understood Eskom's reason that, you know what, we're dealing with a dangerous industry. We can't make anything 100% safe. And the court took taken that into consideration, and I bet that we're going to have that in the questions a little bit later, saying that, you know, we've got all the standards, but we can't make anything 100% safe. And the court said, you know what, we see that, we acknowledge it, all right? But the court said, we are, and I highlighted here in blue, it's not necessarily that we go into depth in order to provide a product that was 100% safe. But the question is rather, if it was possible to do so by reason of fault of design or improper installation need not be decided. They don't look at to say, you know, whatever the case may go wrong. The point is that although formidable in appearance, the device in reality did not constitute an effective barrier. The court evaluated the evidence. It looked at the pylon itself. It looked at the NRS codes. All right. The fact that it could be easily sidestepped by an 11-year-old to be electrocuted. The court took all of that into consideration, right? And the court even evaluated the costs, all right, the cost and effort, and they even considered what the difference would be in this particular instance, they evaluated Eskom against the city of Cape Town. So the court applied the reasonable practicable test as well as the negligence test here in order to evaluate the obligations of the supplier. And I just want to ensure that we have got, at this particular stage, we're just focusing quickly on the supplier's obligation, your municipality and Eskom's and the NRS per se, the liability that ensues from that. And yeah, it's a double slide, but I wanted to point out, I first wanted to discuss the court's reasoning and the procedure that they followed. And the conclusion was, it follows therefore that in my view, Eskom failed to rebut the presumption of negligence. On the contrary, negligence on its part was established on the evidence, and Eskom's appeal must accordingly fail. So in this particular case, Eskom failed, and they were held liable for the electrocution and the consequences of the electrocution. Although they complied to the NRA specification, although they did anything a little bit reasonable that they possibly could, in order to avoid the electrocution, the court and they complied to the electrical machine regulations. They did everything 100% correct. The court said, however, the NRS code doesn't actually provide us with too much information, but we are looking at other standards in the industry. But besides that, you are still liable. And this is why I want to say this is a disaster for when standards form a disaster for suppliers, in the sense that we impose these duties, we impose these obligations, but we're not very much prescriptive or definitive or define what we need to comply with. We just impose these general duties. And obviously we expose the suppliers by incorporating these standards in the bylaws for negligence. So when we collaborate by standards, we have to take into consideration that even though the supplier might comply 100% to a standard, that there is also negligence, and we should be very specific before we just incorporate these standards. But we need to collaborate to make sure that there's a comprehensive understanding of what the obligation is, what we are trying to negate, and what is it ultimately that we want to deal with. But it's not just the suppliers that face the same risk. The users are well. This particular case was in 2000. Although the case number is 2013, it came in front of a court in 2016, and the court specifically dealt with the provisions of Section 9 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. All right. And here the court deviated and said Section 9 imposes a strict liability on the user, on the employer. All right. And that strict liability imposes a standard of duty of care in absolute terms. In other words, the court said you must comply with the prescribed health and safety standards. And in this particular case, the SANS 1014 Part 1. All right. The liability of the employer is a strict one, and there's not necessary to consider other parallel legislation in this regard. So in this particular instance, the matter dealt with the fact that somebody was electrocuted while being a subcontractor for somebody else, and the family then sued the main contractor for compensation. And one of the allegations was that there wasn't any compliance with the health and safety standard. All right. And the given standard of care is already hardwired into the Occupational Health and Safety Act.
Sorry, Rowan, I'm so sorry to cut you. I don't think you can see hands because you're presenting.
Yes, sorry.
Yes, I would just like to nudge on time since there's a second part of the presentation.
It's the last slide.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
So in terms of Section 9, the court said they are deviating in terms of the situation a little bit different in terms of Section 26 of the Electricity Regulation Act that suppliers face. Your user and installer faces a compliance of strict liability. All right, and the court's not going to ask whether there is a fault or the negligence. They are just going to ask on the requirement: are you or did you not Are you or are you not compliant with the standard? And in terms of paragraph 35, I just want to read that. Given that the standard of care is already hardwired in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, together with the regulations, any existing fault, whether dolus or culpa, meaning negligence or willful, is inherent and can be inferred from the failure to meet the prescribed standard if it's found from the facts. All right. So it means that if you don't comply with the standard, you are, in a sense, strictly liable for any damages at all. So, and that therefore there must be a distinction between the question that a supplier faces, but the strict liability on a user is in a sense the same. But if a user doesn't comply with the SANS 10142 Part 1 or any other health and safety, is automatically negligent in terms of Section 9. All right. And then it's just a further explanation of further clarity, but the link is in the court case. And here's my proposition for success of standards, right? And it's also imposed by the NRS. There must be a whole collaboration, and we need to collaborate before we approve standards. That we need to collaborate, that we need to consult, we need to provide not only the industry stakeholders, but members of the public, members of other stakeholders, to collaborate in order for us to get to a comprehensive solution, ultimately at the end of the day. All right. And this is what we as BravoScan advocate, is that we must recommend a holistic approach. We shouldn't isolate specific industries or specific bodies, that we should adopt a holistic approach over the whole industry in order to ensure that both the users, the electrical contractors, and the suppliers are equally protected, because all of them, any stakeholder, face an equal strenuous legal duty of care. All right. I hope that helps, and I'm going to hand over to Leon to take over the second part of it, and then we'll take questions from there.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate that thorough input there. Leon, are you ready to go for us?
Yes. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Perfect. I know. And again, thank you very much to Sapphire and Rowan for your comprehensive explanation of the laws and regulations that we all have to follow. So my presentation is a little bit shorter than what Rowan's is, and I'm more talking about the technical aspects of the NRS and how it incorporates or differs from SANS 10142. And then regarding the misapplication and misalignment from the industry. Okay. Move that thing. Okay, so I basically just made a small table here just to show the differences between NRS and SANS 10142 and their specific aspects. And so the type of document that NRS is, as Rowan explained, it's more of a technical specification, where the SANS 10142 is a standard, which is referred to in the Standards Act, and then both have their specific purposes. Now, each one of these different aspects I'm going into a little bit deeper. But the purpose of the NRS is to regulate the grid interconnection of embedded generation. So if we look at the NRS, there are many aspects of the NRS. There's NRS 097-2-1 that specifically regulates the grid interconnection. But then we have also -2-3, which is more on the MV side. We have different types of NRS specifications. So it is not just this specific one that NRS creates, but this one is the most, I don't want to say contentious one, but the one that everybody knows about, because City of Cape Town and all of the other municipalities made us aware of this specification. So the scope of SANS is it applies to all installations, and that includes the grid-tied, the off-grid, and UPS systems, where the NRS only is specific to the grid-tied type of systems. And as Rowan mentioned, there are different regulatory authorities, which I don't necessarily have to go into or reiterate from Rowan's side. And one of the most important aspects is the product certification. And I've heard many people say, "Oh, this product is not certified by NRS," and that is either misspeaking or uninformed, because NRS does not certify any products. They only provide the specifications for certain products. Now, SANS 10142 also does not certify any products. We also cannot in SANS 10142 incorporate any product that does not have product certification. In section 4.1 of SANS 10142, it gives a list of specific products that have standards, and those standards that are managed by NRCS. And the enforcement thereof is also by NRCS, where the enforcement in NRS is only done by the municipality, whether it is written into the bylaw, as Rowan mentioned. So the applicability I mentioned already. Okay, so now I'm going into a little bit deeper. So NRS 097 is the technical specification for the grid-tied embedded generation, and those are inverters that can feedback or have the ability to feedback or export back to the grid. And a UPS type of system or an off-grid type of system cannot export back unless it is faulty. So that is why municipalities enforce NRS and require that those inverters comply with the NRS 097, so that they can control which systems exports back into their grid. SANS 10142 already has provisions for the installation and the safety requirements for all systems, whether it is grid-tied or standalone, and it only excludes the integration part of it. And that is where NRS specifically comes in on how the integration needs to function, how it needs to operate together with the grid. Otherwise, you get grid instability, and we all know what happens when we have grid instability. So the compliance should be based on system functionality, and grid-tied systems must adhere to those type of systems where they are applicable, while all the installations must comply with 10142. Product compliance and certification. The NRS, again, does not certify or approve the products. It only gets technical parameters and product specification standards for grid compliance. And one of those standards
Leon, I think we've lost you there. You've gone to mute.
Okay. Can you hear me? Am I back?
Yes, 100%. Yeah, continue.
Okay. The product approval falls under NRCS, which issues a letter of authority for all of those electrical products. If I remember correctly, most inverters or UPS systems falls under VC 8055 from the NRCS, and there was one that was issued in 2017, and it was retracted. So we are pleading with NRCS to provide new standards for those applicable inverters which will also include the 6109 inverters, then I think it will alleviate a lot of our back and forth with the suppliers as well. So this NRCS is mandated under the Electrical Installation Regulations 2, and where there is no NRCS approval or certification, Electrical Installation Regulation 5.3 allows the supplier, which will be Eskom, City of Cape Town, City of Joburg, or whichever other municipality, to approve those products. Now, this is where the key difference comes in, is NRS doesn't certify the product. The supplier only approves the product. And this is where the inverter list from City of Cape Town comes into play. But apart from that, the entire installation still needs to comply with the Electrical Installation Regulations and SANS 10142, whether it is a grid-tied connection or other type of connection. So the municipalities should enforce product compliance based on all the applicable legal standards, not exclusively the NRS 097, as 097 does not cover all the inverter types. Sorry, I'm trying to go to the next slide. Okay. Yes, Gareth, sorry, you raised your hand.
Do you want us to, are you sorted there? Would you like assistance? Are you?
No.
Okay, fine.
Okay. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so as mentioned, the 097 applies specifically to grid interconnected embedded generations and does not cover all the other ones as well, such as UPS systems, which is covered under SANS 62040. And a lot of other products are covered by that standard. And my plea for the municipalities is that it should incorporate all of the other standards, not just the NRS specification. The NRS definitely has a space in this area, in this field, because it's their grid. So they need to protect the grid. But the municipality has to take into consideration what other applications is allowed to be installed. So SANS 10142 does make provision for other types of installations, and under 7.12.6.1, if it is a parallel system with a grid as an alternative supply, there are additional restrictions, and these additional restrictions are unnecessary, set out by the municipalities. So ER 57 specifically prohibits undue supplier restrictions, which ensuring legally recognized standards remain applicable, such as that specific section under SANS 10142. A broader standards-based approach is needed, allowing compliance flexibility for different types of alternative supply. Standards should be applied correctly. NRS has a defined role, but should not override other standards. Compliance should align with SANS 10142 and other IEC standards where applicable, and municipalities must follow the electrical installation regulations where they are prohibited from restricting certain things. And a balanced approach is needed with collaboration between NRS and SANS. And I'm happy to say that the NRS and its chairperson, we are collaborating very, very well at this stage. We have done multiple tests, and we are also on the same page regarding different things, and we really appreciate that from the NRS side, and we hope that we can continue to collaborate with NRS and with SANS so that we can make the industry better and provide everybody clear clear guidances. That is my end.
All right. Thank you so much, Leon, and thank you to Ruan. Ruan, are you still with us to be able to answer some questions?
By all means, sorry.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Really appreciate it. I think that was quite comprehensive in terms of NRS and NRCS, the laws being laid down. So let's answer some of the questions. And now I want to invite those of you who are joining us to go to the Q&A section. We're going to run through a couple of questions. And Leon and Ruan, if you want to just jump in, I'll just run through some of the questions. There's Mkita just reminding me that while focusing on these roles, it's important to note that registering small-scale embedded generation, SSEG, as you've mentioned, is mandatory for homeowners and business to ensure safety, compliance, and grid stability. We've been clarifying now that that was for the grid-connected systems, and they provided a clarifying document that is available in the Q&A that you can click on that link as well. There's a question regarding if the inverters that do not feed power into the grid are not required to comply with NRS 107, how can the City of Cape Town not allow it to be installed? I think you've covered it a little bit. I don't know if you'd want to make a comment there.
Well, my answer is ultimately at the end of the day, at this particular instance, it's in terms of the bylaws that you need to register, because they need to control fire responses, what happens where. We had the instance the other day, although they don't have a grid tie connection, but you have to understand that the supplier is in a sense accountable. They've got the right to inspect your electrical installation. So they need to know in the event that they should be. So according to you, that inverter might not be grid tied, but the municipality has got the right to register or to ensure that that there is compliance. And the only way in order to manage that is in order to register that. This is now obviously with Eskom's registration requirements at the end of the day. There's various legislations at play here. It's not just the electrical installation regulations. It's your bylaws, it's your Electricity Regulation Act, and each one is just trying to circumvent or limit accountability on the, like I said, the extensive liability that I communicated. And all of these stakeholders just trying to manage the system in that regard. So it's not that your municipality just because it's not grid tied doesn't have accountability or an obligation towards you. There is also an obligation to verify and to make sure that there is compliance on that regard. So yeah, it's a very complex topic, and I understand that why people are upset, but at the end of the day, there's risks that need to be managed.
Yeah, so just in the chat, Tony says commissioning requires a COC, SANS, therefore it's covered SANS. And Tina says since the supplier is responsible up to a point of supply, why do they make you install the needed equipment for them before control on supply side, specifically Eskom?
That's a difficult aspect to answer. I would love to just do a little bit of research in terms of that. I'm not quite sure where the requirement comes from that you need to comply with these. Obviously, the municipality is accountable up to the point of supply. But obviously there's other different policies and procedures in place when it comes to the upgrade of the system. And obviously the municipalities try to offset some of these costs and expenses onto specific users if it's for that sole benefit of that user. But I'm not well formed in terms of the bylaws and the procedures in terms of that. But the only way that will be enforceable if it's incorporated into a policy or procedure somewhere. If I'm not mistaken, Leon.
Maybe I can answer that. So, Dennis, I think you're referring to the dead grid safety lock that is applicable through the NRS. So, as far as I remember, that specification has been taken out because it should be incorporated in the appliance or in the inverter itself. So according to the SANS 6109, to what the inverter is manufactured to, it already includes something very similar. It's a grid safety relay, something in that line. which basically just disconnects the grid completely if there is no grid available. So I actually found one the other day where that one failed, and it was pushing back power to the grid while it was load shedding, and that is the reason why they actually want that device in. But it was removed from the specifications as far as I know. Maybe some parts of Eskom still require it. I've heard some people say that some parts still require it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think he confirmed that that's exactly what he was referring to. So thank you for that. Let's move to Warwick. He says, what aspects of NRS 097-2-1 or -2-3 are considered to be overreach by yourselves? What aspects of that? It's in the Q&A session there from Warwick.
Yo, they're not kind to us. I'm gonna put the depends slide. I'm gonna refer to it depends as to what municipality you refer to and everything. Obviously, nobody wants too much over-regulation, you know, and I think that we should take into consideration what is the intent and the specific purpose of the standards that we're trying to regulate, and what's the specific outcome that we're trying to achieve. So obviously, BravoScan is I want to say sometimes on the enforcement side, and unfortunately we also face these challenges ultimately at the end of the day. And I just want to explain, and it might come, my answer might come with it long term, but at the end of the day, there might be different ways of approaching or reaching a solution. And that is what we face as BravoScan in terms of the one of these aspects with the calculation of Earth. But in that act or in the legislation, the one procedure is advocated for or is mandated. It might not be the best procedure, but that is the procedure that is mandated in the act or in the specifications on the standard. And ultimately, what we're trying to achieve is obviously a safe installation with good earth or good grounding. And now you might argue that it might be overreach if you're enforced into a particular way because another one might be available. But when we're dealing with standard specifications, it's the lowest amicable, widely accepted approach in the industry. It might not cover all of the aspects. It might not cover everything, but it's the lowest denominator that everybody can agree to. So I don't want to fray into to say that it's overreach. I might be saying that some stuff are unnecessary and stuff might be taken out of context. But I do think that we need to have a rationalization that, especially to standards and regulation, is this really necessary? And what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve? Because of the severity of conflicts and that we find in the industry. And a lot of engineers will advocate for the NRS when the SANS 10142 Part 1 might be in conflict thereof. And we need clarity on to say, this is the procedure. You start off with the NRS. We advocate, obviously, for the procedure that's set out in the electrical installation regulations. And everything else basically then just adds on to or builds on top of it. And I understand why you might feel it that it's overreach, Warwick, but at the end of the day, the SANS 10142 Part 1 can't cover everything. So there might be situations that we need to rely on the NRS. So I cannot concede that some of it's overreach, but I do think that there's some of it that we really need to reconsider and just to obtain clarification and just rationalize it.
I think from my side, it's not necessarily overreach from our side, but where the industry doesn't like certain things. For one example, that the nameplate rating, and I know that that specific discussion is in the working group or in the NRS at the moment. So I know that NRS is also taking certain steps and listening to the industry. So I have to give that to them as well. That it's not a completely closed group that they don't want to listen to anybody. And Warwick, I know that you are a member of the NRS. So spilling
right.
the beans here.
Thanks very much for that. So if you have any more comments, you're welcome to put it through onto the Q&A session. There's a question about, can we ask about the legality of PV cable used? We'll try, I think, post the question, Kali, and we'll see what we can do. I want to jump down one of the first questions, gentlemen, that came up from Delani early on as Ruan was speaking. This is nice occupational health and safety question on Section 10. What is the duration for the parties to be accountable? For example, if the installer completed the work 3 years back, but not up to standard at the time, should they still be responsible after 3 years? Great question.
I wish to say that there was a limitation, and electricians, this is one of the biggest concerns of electricians, is because there isn't that limitation on accountability. You are still liable ultimately at the end of the day. Obviously, there's a lot of what we call the causality link that you need to take into consideration. How many people were between there was did the user maintain the installation, or because ultimately, if there's nothing changed into the installations are built with the intent to last. So you can't say after a year or after 2 years my COC lapses. We find COCs in the industry that was dated back to the 1950s, and that COC is technically still valid because the installation hasn't been changed. So all I'm just trying to say is there is no limitation on liability or duration. And that is why compliance and proof of compliance and proof of the installation, all of that is within the control of the electrical contractor, and no job is done until the paperwork is done. So you need to sit down and make sure that all of this, you capture all of the information of the project, but because you don't know when they are going to knock on your door. And currently with solar and the rate in which solar is installed, and obviously manufacturer or the quantity, the frequency of and the likelihood that the department's going to knock on your door has increased. So, and it's no longer that you can get away, install the installation 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and you will not be held liable. Leon can explain a little bit, but the failure rate that we find is that for the electrical installation works perfectly for 6 to 8 months, and then suddenly have a failure rate, or it can work for up to 3 years, and then there might be an overload, and then there might be a critical failure. And that's unfortunately the risk that the electricians face. You don't know when, although you installed it incorrectly, then you relied technically on the safe installation of the component itself, up until the point that then it fails, and then the user is actually aware of the issue or the mistake, and then he gets his buddy out to conduct an inspection, or he approaches us, and then we say, you know what, the installation failed because you created a hard connection, or there was there was not proper earthing, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, but there's no limitation on accountability.
Professor Beek has just asked, in terms of this, Ruan, can you talk quickly about the grid code as well, in terms of the law, the grid code?
I'm not very well versed in terms of the grid code. I read up to Section 26, because then I know the liabilities on and the onus is on the supplier. But obviously there is a obligation to ensure that the grid is stable, and if the grid is not stable and there might be consequences of that instability on the user's end, the user has got a claim against the supplier. Leon, perhaps you can incorporate a little bit more detail. I don't know if there's something specific about the grid code that you need answer to, but in terms of liability and accountability, even though there might be a grid code, the supplier is accountable.
So honestly, from my side, I haven't ever even read the grid code. Ruan, and that's a different code to the Electricity Regulation Act. So the grid code is supplied by NERSA for all the municipalities to adhere to. If I remember correctly, Dr. Johan. I think maybe if we can, Gareth, if there is a space, maybe we can open the mic to
Okay.
Dr. Bekers.
Okay, I'll do that. I just want to just quickly mention, because we did say we would finish at 1. We do understand that some may want to leave us, but I think the conversation, there's a few more questions. We're happy to continue, and so I will open that mic there. Just but we just have to keep an eye on time. We still have some other questions. Thank you, Warwick, for your graphic comment there. All right, Prof. Bekers, we are giving the professor the microphone. Go for it.
This, yeah, I think we just need to talk about the grid code. We can do it in future, perhaps, but 50% of NRS 097-2-1 involves the grid code requirements, which is also a legal requirement. We talk about safety a lot this morning, and I think in future we should perhaps cover the grid code aspects, because we need to meet the requirements of the grid code if we want to connect any generation to any grid in South Africa, and that is 50% of the aspects in NRS.
Okay.
Yeah, well, what we approached was, and I would definitely do some research into that. But yeah, we aimed obviously to deal with from the user side. Our aim was obviously the manufacturers and product installers and everything. We didn't focus too much on the suppliers' obligations. We focused on the end user aspect, but definitely that is something that we need to do research into.
Okay, let's go to Butter. He's asking in the Q&A, we have RTFs that are non-bidirectional, meaning that they can only act as a load. Currently, the City of Cape Town does not support installations of this type for registration. What would you advise?
Leon, this is technical. It's you.
This is legal. As I mentioned a few times in my slides, is that I'm asking City of Cape Town to also consider the other types of systems, not just those that are manufactured through 62109, and there are many other hurdles as well from other manufacturers. For example, let me say the name, Geezerwise, because they also have a product that incorporates PV, but because their product does not comply with SANS 62109, they are not allowed to be installed within the City of Cape Town because it doesn't fall under the specifications that NRS 097 talks about. So there are a lot of hurdles, and I don't know if SAPVIA can maybe reach out to City of Cape Town, or maybe we can have a meeting with SALGA or AMEU or anything like that.
Leon, can I interject also here?
Go for it.
It's one thing that it's in the slides is the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act. So if any decision of a supplier, meaning the municipality, affects you in any way, like you have got the right to request reasons for that decision, and if you get a copy of the slides, the sections are in terms of are in there. So you just bring an application. The municipalities have these type of procedures in place on their websites. You just put out your question, and they have to provide you with your information or a rationalization of their decision to either include or exclude certain things in terms of your installation. And based on that reasons, then you can take it forward ultimately at the end. But I think for starting point, just to get the proper reasons in writing as to why or why not do they permit it or do not permit it, and then from there on, you can make an informed decision as to how to approach the situation.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I want to just say to those of you who are still with us, I know many of you going, we really appreciate your time. This is the first from our working group, and we hope to do more webinars. We really want to educate and create awareness, and perhaps some of you who are involved in local manufacturing would like to join our working group as well. Myself and Patrick Governor co-chair this working group, and yes, we want these audiences in terms of the City of Cape Town and the NRS and SAPVIA are playing such a pivotal role in that. Boikanyo is also saying that he's been having connection problems. Registration is now necessary. Many customers have grid-tied system. I wonder if we can't just, and please, I'm ending it just because I want to honor everyone's time, but we're more than happy to have another conversation around this. But Ruan and Leon, I wonder if we can have just a closing comment from you. And I really do, I see that some of you would like to have some more questions, and we definitely want to do that, and we can get more involved. And maybe you've got other topics you'd like us to cover. We'd like to do that. But you know, the validity of COC, the everything that we've been speaking about, versus sort of what a municipality decides and saying, sorry, this is it. You know, where does the law? That's what this conversation is about. Is what does the law say? What do we have as the consumers, as installers, as manufacturers? What do we have to stand on? And maybe you can make some final comments just with that in mind, and Boikanyo's question there as well, if you mind.
Obviously, and I'm going to advise from, if anybody approaches me with this question, all right, you're going to start off with the electrical installation regulations and your obligations of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The standards of the electrical installation regulations has got a specific clause to rein in your municipalities at the end of the day. But we're going to start off with the obligation there. Then we're going to look at you know, is whatever the other obligations that are imposed, are they promoting or enforcing or addressing a loophole or whatever the case may be? And then you'll have a starting point ultimately to be on. But you have to understand that your suppliers and your municipalities are state organs. They need to provide you with reasons. You know, in spite of the NRS and the NRCS, all of them are, with exception now with the NRS, but your government organizations have to provide valid reasons. So yes, we are talking into hypotheticals here, but if we want to get to a particular outcome, we have to be very specific, and reasons need to be given. It cannot be somebody in an office making a decision because he or she is motivated or feels like it on a particular day to take that decision. There must be rationalization. And if more electricians, more users, more suppliers promote or request or enforce their rights in terms of the promotion of Justice Act, Just Administration Act, my apologies, or request clarity from the suppliers, the municipalities, as to why these regulations are imposed, and participation in these type of committees, then definitely there would be a uniformed outcome ultimately at the end of the day. So first of all, do not, if you feel you're being affected, consider the application, what is need to be happen. If you're still unhappy at the end of the day, and you cannot submit yourself to whatever the application will be, or you think that it is causing you some distress or harm, exercise your right in order to obtain clarification and the rationalization of that decision. From the rationalization of that decision, you'll necessarily see if it's an appealable decision, where do you need to go, and then you can make an informed decision ultimately at the end of the day. And that is what we're advocating. Well, that was the purpose of this seminar in any case from my end.
Yeah, Leon, really appreciate you doing it, especially from the courtroom. Thank you so much. Leon, your closing comments?
Yeah, someone mentioned earlier in one of the comments, SANS 1142-1-2, because it was on one of the pictures that Ruan showed, and but that standard is dead. It's not. It won't see the light. But the specific information that was in that standard is being incorporated as an annexure to the SANS 1142, and there is hopefully a lot of work to be done within the SANS 1142, especially section 7.12, which has alternative supplies and off-grid type solutions and so on. So there's a lot of work that is being done by the working groups and by NRS. I know there are a few people that sit on NRS that are also part of this annexure that will become part of the 114G. So it is I'm very happy to see the collaboration between all the parties and that there is actually something being done now for the standards and the safety of the installations.
Thank you, Leon. I really do appreciate it. Just before we say goodbye, Warwick, I see you've had your hand up. We've opened up your microphone if you'd like to make a comment. Okay, you put your hand down. All right. Thank you, everybody. All right, just once again, many of you asking maybe you could be part of the working group. You'd like to find out more information. Is this presentation going to be available? The answer is yes, yes, yes. We really want to keep talking. We've got some exciting ideas of other webinars that perhaps are going to be brought out from this. So yeah, thank you for all the information being shared. NRS 097, SANS, SSEG, so many things to discuss. It's opened up a lot of thoughts from many of you, so really do appreciate it. Look out for our next webinar. Zimkita, who's also part of the team, has been commenting. She will has put her email address there, zimkita@sapvia.co.za, if you'd like more information about the working groups as well. We meet sort of quarterly, and we've got some objectives to really promote local manufacturing. That's really the key. And perhaps that might not be the right working group for you. SAPVIA has got many working groups that you can connect to as well. I want to say a very big thank you to our two speakers. I'm sure you'll join me in doing that. Ruan and Leon, I'm so glad I met you a little while ago. Your insight, your knowledge is incredible, and I think we're grateful in the industry to have you and your wisdom shared with us. So thank you so much for sharing with us. We'd love to call on you again and ask some more questions. So thank you to both of you. Really appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. We will be in touch through the SAPVIA team to share more information. So thank you, everybody, and have a blessed day. Thank you.
Thank you, SAPVIA. Thank you to everybody that joined. Hopefully it was informative.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, guys.
The pleasure was. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues.
Pleasure.